we meet about 150 years and 2 days, actually, after Confederate artillerymen shelled a small Union force on an island off the coast of South Carolina. And a day later, that force surrendered to the Confederacy for what turned out to be the starting skirmish of the American Civil War. And tonight we are fast approaching the first anniversary of Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf, which took place on April 20th last year and resulted in the largest oil spill in history. The participants in the Writers in Motion program have explored 4 seminal periods in American history, all of which mark our country today. And I think it's wonderful to take the study of history out of a classroom, out of the books, and make it a real, tangible experience.
I am Pamela from Jamaica. Anything that resists, anything that tries to become its own thing and tell its own story, that inevitably always resonates most with me, because I like rebellion.
My name is Vicente Garcia Groyon, and I'm from the Philippines. Who I am today is a direct result of the things that have happened in my country, to my country over the years. And of course, America is a very big part of that. And ever since we came under the control of a foreign country, of another culture, we've gradually lost a lot of things. To believe that what is better lies outside, that's something that I think all Filipinos need to deal with, to get over.
I'm always working in the shadow of growing up with a father who survived the Cambodian genocide. Writers are at different stages of dealing with fall and recovery, and you can see it on their faces, you can see it on the things they say. So when I read our Burmese writers' piece, it looks deceptively simple. I went to Gettysburg, I saw these things about civil war, but civil war is happening in my country, and that resonates because I spent so much time with her.
Burmese people are suffering for survival because of the political situation. I was living in Burma for 40 years as a writer, so we have a lot of problems because we don't have transparency.
My name is Eduardo Halfon. I can be from Guatemala, where I was born, or I can be from Florida, where I grew up, or I can be from Spain, where my books are published and where I'm legally from now. Or I can be from the Midwest. I can be a Nebraskan, where I now live. I can be Jewish, my family's Jewish, and I can be Arab, my family's Arab. I can be both. So I have all these layers of identity. Some of you read part of it. Is a story based on my grandfather's experience in the Holocaust in Auschwitz, specifically in Auschwitz.
I'm from Kenya, a middle-sized country in East Africa, where traveling to the States is a big deal. Everyone, especially my generation, really wanted to come to the States because of the kind of political and socio-economic things that were going on there. Where I come from, the barriers work at many levels. But the one of the big ones, obviously, not obviously, but the big one is class and education.
So Canada, I think, has shaped my writing probably in more ways than I am conscious of. I think it's a good place to be a writer. It's just, there's a lot of room, there's a lot of space, there's a lot of generosity of spirit, and I feel there's an openness to many kinds of stories because it's a country that it's a country of multiple cultures, multiple identities, and it's not fixed.
The war that happened in Bosnia was so destroying, so overwhelming, so deep in destruction that it takes really long to see signs of recovery. Everyone says that at some point, you have to get over it, and life goes on and things like that. But this is also connected with amnesia, and if we want to, I'm a little bit frustrated by the fact that we are supposed to live as nothing bad ever happened, because that's how we are going to show that we are strong and moving forward.
It's near dusk, July 1st. Union troops have been routed. There's the belief that if the Confederate assault continued, they took that high ground, that the Battle of Gettysburg would be over. Commanding the Confederate troops in this area, a man named Richard Ewell. He had just taken over for the famous Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had been mortally wounded by his men at Chancellorsville the previous May and had died. Jackson was the second most famous Confederate officer next to Lee. He had this sort of reputation of being able to achieve victory against the most impossible odds. And he was also seen as unrelenting in his aggressiveness. Ewell decides not to continue the assault on July the 1st. Now here's the key part about the American memory and especially the South's fascination with Gettysburg. If only Stonewall Jackson had been alive, what would have happened? He would have led troops storming up Cemetery Hill. Battle of Gettysburg would have been over in one day. Then what would have happened after that? Well, Confederate troops would have kept advancing, marching on to Washington. D.C. would have fallen, and we'd have Confederate independence. We'd be singing Dixie today. As this guy said to me, he said, "We almost got him at Gettysburg." And I thought, what the hell are you talking about here? We mean we almost got him? We weren't there. I said, well, let's just sort of play this out for you. Jackson stormed Cemetery Hill. Battle of Gettysburg's a Confederate victory. You get your independence. Does that mean you really want two separate nations? Does that mean that you really prefer that the institution of slavery would have survived past 1865? Now, of course, he got very defensive about that, but the point is that then these sort of scenarios that people embark on, they engage in, they never think about the implications of what they really sort of are desiring, or what they, at least they think what they desire.
Such a fine line. I mean, if people are marching on to an obvious death, is that courage? I mean...
A man who came here, though, a day after the battle, not even a day after the battle, he came here on July the 2nd. He wrote describing this area. "I saw a sight which was perfectly sickening and heartrending in the extreme. It would have satiated the most bloodthirsty and cruel man on God's earth. There were, within a few feet of us by actual count, 79 North Carolinians laying dead in a straight line. I stood on their right and looked down their line. It was perfectly dressed. 3 had fallen in the front, the rest had fallen backward. Yet the feet of all these dead men were in perfectly straight line. Great God, when will this horrid war stop?" And this is a critical point here, and Northerners don't get it. The burden of Southern history. Defeat during the Civil War, and the guilt of holding slaves. And it still, I believe, very much permeates the white community. As we make our left-hand turn here, look up to the left, is where Lincoln gave his address on November 19th.
Brother, you are walking beside me, and I believed you when you spoke of shame.
What does fighting for the slaves, what does working for the poor have to do with recovering from meaninglessness or disaster? As in the case of the Gettysburg Address, writing can matter. Beautiful writing can make a difference in the world, and that cannot be questioned. So the task for Lincoln is to explain why we are doing this. So that was his task, and in some ways you can think of the Gettysburg Address as the decisive event of the Civil War, because without it, it might not have turned out the way it did.
What's amazing about the Gettysburg Address is that we're in the midst of a civil war, and in any way is he trying to condemn, damn, or demonize the enemy. There's a certain optimism that pervades that address. But that need for redemption, it comes back to, we talked about why people come to the battlefield here, and it's again a strange sort of thing, that you would come to this killing ground and come away with it finding something redemptive in your fellow man. It's really quite remarkable.
And I was thinking of this when you talked about this eternal American optimism. I mean, I think one of the reasons it's possible for people to leave here optimistic is because so much is covered over. You know, I mean, yes, they can come here and it's a battleground, and the staggering numbers of people who died here, and you can leave optimistic. It's probably because you're not thinking really of the terms of the catastrophe.
I just wanted to comment on that, what we were talking about, of danger of that kind of postmodernist interpretation of past. And I'm having a problem with that postmodernist concept because the war in my country wasn't like 150 years ago, but 2 decades ago. And although we do have facts about some things, there are some major events that are subject of different interpretations. For instance, there was this big massacre in eastern Bosnia in Srebrenica when 8,000 people were killed, and there were 3 verdicts in Hague on international court for genocide. So it's clear who did what. And I was in Germany a week ago on book fair, and there was a presentation of the book Srebrenica. How was it actually? How was it really? Like, people were representing their side of the story. And I'm curious about that because in a way it makes me angry. I respect everyone's rights to have their story and point of view, but sometimes I feel as a human being that it's wrong to have your story if you are denying crimes.
Has anyone written about the Civil War?
I think being around here, the Civil War seems very cheesy to people. You don't want to touch it.
It's easy to see how far as a nation we've come from the Civil War. But then when I'm here, it's like the people in this town are still living it. And there's like still such a Union and Confederate pride. Some people just still haven't gotten past that and still haven't gotten past those issues. And it's like the rest of the country, I'm not going to say has, but it's still such a focal point here. And a lot of people like still walk around in that time period dress and reenact. And because there's still such a focus on it here, it's almost hard to move beyond it.
I was fascinated by the fact that people still have discussions about what happened 150 years ago, and that people have different arguments, but without getting, in a way, too emotional. I mean, what I would like to bring with me, the possibility to discuss things and not to have the same opinion about it, and to look for knowledge in order to interpret it.
Well, there is an intellectual distance here, I think, with regard to the relationship to the war. I've done a lot of research in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's very much more emotional. You know, just don't say certain things to them because they'll get very upset. Here, I think you could say anything you want, and people would take it as a point of debate that would be interesting to discuss.
Anytime the seatbelt sign is on. Even if the sign is off, please keep your seatbelt fastened in case we experience unexpected rough air. Federal regulations require all passengers to comply with crew instructions posted placards and lighted
You were wrong, trying hard not to notice while we walk.
The other bus carrying freedom riders ran into a major melody in Birmingham itself.
As we got off the bus, we decided to proceed with our plans. As we entered the waiting room, the men who were aligned around the walls came toward us. Then they took me and forced me out the door and threw me into the crowd, and I was beaten by one big guy and several others.
So I was wondering, what is with the children or grandchildren of those people? Is there anyone trying to explore that? And I can understand that it's extremely painful. I would be interested to read in that, like how people deal with things like that in their family.
I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I would probably say that most of us have, at some point, we have family members that were in the Ku Klux Klan, and those family members have probably passed away, but also, like I know with my own family, it's just something that no one talks about.
I didn't want to write my grandfather's story for many reasons. You know, he told it to me, I think it was 99 or 2000, and it took me about 7 years of resisting. I just didn't want to face that part of my past, of my family, of what, you know, I didn't want to offend him. I didn't want to offend his memory. I didn't want to make light of a very serious, you know, situation. But I think if you're gonna write, that's especially what you have to face, no?
It didn't take long, got picked a fight here.
I think that's what shocked me about the conversation with them yesterday, is that, oh yeah, most families here have a clan member, but we don't talk about it. It should be easier for us as grandkids, you know, and that's why I think I was the one who faced my grandfather's story. It skipped a generation. My mom's generation didn't know that story.
Both my parents were Chinese Cambodian, and my father survived the genocide. So they came to Australia as refugees. When I started to write my next book, I realised that there were some things you couldn't take lightly. There were some things you couldn't be all that funny about. And believe me, I tried. I tried to write about the Cambodian Holocaust in a funny way. It just doesn't work. So when I turned 28, I realised, this is the same age my father was when he was surviving the fields. And then I started to think about growing up. And the same hands that rubbed, you know, ointment on my stomach when I had stomach aches were the same hands that used a hoe and sickle to plant rice, and the same hand that dug graves for his friends, and the same hands that, you know, gave acupuncture with these copper wires that he found on the ground to people who, usually children whose limbs were almost disabled because they'd be punished by having their hands tied behind their backs. And then that made me realise that this is something I wanted to write about.
And that's how the rest of the country came to support the civil rights movement. They saw this.
Birmingham was founded in 1871, so smack in the middle of Reconstruction. This is a city of Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan by the 1920s was a major part of Birmingham and southern and outside the South political life. In Birmingham and other cities, though, the Ku Klux Klan is also going to be the mayors and the council people and the bankers and the lawyers, so it's very much entrenched. And then in 1963, of course in September, the Ku Klux Klan bombed the church and the 4 little girls were killed. By that time, Birmingham was known as Bombingham, Bad Birmingham.
And my job is today, I volunteer every Wednesday to come in and tell the story about 16th Street Baptist Church and how I got involved in civil rights. So on September the 15th, 1963, at 10:30 that morning, somebody placed a bomb, and you'll find out who it was. Up on the stairwell was on the outside of the church right there. And the stairwell, and the bomb went off, and the other side of the wall was a girls' dressing room. There were a lounge area and a stall area. There were 5 little girls in the dressing room. 1 little girl was in the stall area, and the other 4 little girls was in the lounge area. And when the bomb went off and went through the rubbish, the 4 little girls was found lying on top of each other.
The reason that they chose that church, we suppose, I've never said, but Martin Luther King met there a lot. He met in other places, but this was the church. So this was where the black money and the power and influence was, in that church. And of course it was Sunday morning, so they know they're going to be there. There's some debate about whether these expert explosive people meant to kill, because they bombed before and never had killed. So it's speculated that maybe something went wrong. They didn't mean to do that. They like to threaten and scare. So we don't know for sure.
When I woke this morning, I didn't have no doubt that somebody will bring me out. And we know who that is, our Lord and Savior. Any questions?
During the tensions, during these periods of bombings, was there a continued relationship between whites and blacks in terms of who was taking care? Or black people working in white homes? Were they taking care of children? Were they cooking? Did that continue? So that went on as normal?
Okay. Nothing changed, you know.
Okay.
Just pick up the paper, a home got bombed. Go to the paper, the church got bombed, you know. So, you know, and we still continue to hide and secretly organize and what have you.
Today became personal, became human. You know, we saw a human face. We heard a human voice telling that, you know, what his part of what he saw when he lived through it. So it became personal for me too.
Well, why would the Lord take 4 little girls or 3 little boys and kill them to get us to understand that ain't right? He used what he want to use.
But are you angry? Like,
Me?
Yeah,
Oh
mean,
no, I'm the
just
happiest man you ever seen.
If I were living here
let
at
me
that time,
see.
I would have been really angry.
No, I'm 76 years old. I've been married 57 years. I raised 5 children. I got 8 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren. I'm happy. You know, I got about 75 cents in my pocket, but I'm breathing.
And he honestly seemed to have achieved some sort of peace from what happened. I was drawn to that as well. My grandfather never achieved that.
When I was deciding where I wanted to live, there were 2 things I knew. One was that I wanted a city that was bad enough for me to have an interesting career rebuilding a bad city. The other was that I wanted a city that was good enough for me to have a nice life.
Yeah.
I found it. We're going to spend the next few minutes in West Baltimore. For the neighborhood as a whole, maybe 40% of the houses are vacant. And this is a big neighborhood. This is 2 square kilometers. My team and I have fixed up 15 houses in this street in the last 10 years. And they were vacant before we got here. This neighborhood has about 200 vacant houses.
Do you know how many empty houses are there in Baltimore?
There are at the moment about 15,000 empty houses in Baltimore. The basic serious mess throughout American history started in 1619 when a Dutch ship brought a load of Africans to Jamestown in Virginia. And we Americans embarked on the adventure of slavery. Slavery is a bad idea. If you live in a country that's thinking about having slavery, don't do it. It's bad for slaves, it's bad for masters, it's a bad idea. But in America, it's a huge historical fact.
But you know, the economics, since it's economics, and Charlie Duff said this, all you have to do is make sure there's a kind of economic regeneration. So whether it's white, black, bringing them together, and economics can kind of take care of that. But how do you do that? How would, imagine a Charlie Duff in Birmingham, what would you be selling? Because everyone's man in that time. And now the people who live there, some of them of course don't want to be in that time.
Very hard to have an honest conversation between white Americans and black Americans. Everybody is nervous. White people are afraid they'll say the wrong thing. Black people are afraid that they'll either be too subservient or too aggressive. Nobody likes it. Most people avoid it. And if you're trying to run Baltimore, that's a problem. Baltimore is 60% black, 40% white, and neither race can do this city alone. We've got to figure out how to work together. But we're Americans, and that's tough. When we were driving through West Baltimore, we saw houses and we saw vacant land. And the rule was that wherever you saw vacant land, there used to be houses. That was true here as well. Before this park was created, there were houses here. All of the residents were African Americans. And between 1930 and 1960, Baltimore got 300,000 African Americans from the South and 200,000 white peasants from the South. The first thing that Baltimore City did to cope with its large migration of African Americans from the South was to pass a law making it illegal for African Americans to buy houses in white neighborhoods. The segregated real estate market of Baltimore, which was legally defined by this block white, this block black, held until 1944, and meanwhile the black population went from 100,000 to 400,000. The single toughest issue for Americans is race. It's our great historical disaster. We thought we were starting to make progress at the end of the Civil War, but then we stopped. And we didn't actually do much until about 1955. And if you look at the American cities that are in catastrophic decline, they're cities where race is a big issue. Why did we tear down an entire street? Why did we tear down large parts of Utah Place, this grand boulevard? Why did we take this street that was just a street and widen it like this? There's no traffic on it, it doesn't go anywhere. We were just trying to use the space. Why did we do this? Think about what West Baltimore is like today. Think about the changes that occurred in West Baltimore between, say, 1944 and 1960. Why did this happen?
Divide the city.
To divide the city, that's exactly why it happened. The city government of Baltimore tore down an entire corridor of houses to prevent black people from sloshing into Bolton Hill. It was designed to make it unpleasant to walk. And we want to walk. It was designed to keep white people away from black people, and it's now 50 years later, and although American race relations are very far from perfect, they're not as bad as they were 50 years ago. And now, on both sides of this dividing line, both sides of the old fire break, you've got middle-class people of both races. And they're sick of not being able to walk around their neighborhood. This street has been a racial dividing line for 50 years, and it's now beginning to become a biracial shared operation.
Is about 70% back.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about 70%. By the census, yeah, 70%. Population is 70% of what it was 10 years ago. So, yeah, we just wanted to shoot down here because it's the city where American culture is the most on its sleeve. You know, it's in the streets. It's dance, visual arts, music, cuisine.
Good and bad, no?
Well, the city is as dysfunctional as any place in America, maybe more so. As America becomes more homogeneous and the same neon and the same sort of corporate logos, march from coast to coast, New Orleans resists change. Almost willfully, actually not almost willfully resist change. It's a city that really labors to hold on to its past. That's not to say things don't change and things aren't added, and it's not a museum piece. The music sort of proves that it changes time and time again, but it insists on being rooted in the past of the city, and that's so untrue of most of the country that it's fascinating to watch.
Virtually no one in the United States understands what happened in New Orleans. They all think that a hurricane hit us, and in the United States they talk about Katrina and post-Katrina. Nobody here talks about Katrina. We talk about the levees and the Corps of Engineers. New Orleans is not a historical story. New Orleans is where history arrived first and where the future arrived first. What happened to us is going to happen and continue to happen around the world, and it's even going to happen again in the United States. For the first 3 or 4 years after the flood, when the little children, kindergartners and first and second graders, we draw pictures of their house, and probably it's the same for you. In one window would be the father, in another window the mother, in another window brothers or sisters. All of the children put the whole family on the roof. And these were little 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. For them, a family finds security on the roof, not in the house. Those kids will carry that scar with them forever. And I think the city and everyone who was here either during the flood itself or came back as soon as possible afterwards are different than they were before.
If you move on to New Orleans, there are two things that are being talked about. There's a physical fact of people who are living here and they're no longer living here, but there's a whole thing of feeling of a betrayal, of the fact that nobody came to help you out. So when people talk about recovery, you're talking about have people moved back in, but at the same time, have people recovered their sense of lives and their identities and the love they had of their community. So the recovery bit is tough.
I'm very interested in the bigger picture, the question of the family and the individual, and how this kind of pre-Katrina culture was about the individual versus institution, the state, and all these things.
If you were part of a community, a family, a church, a political bloc, it wasn't that you needed power, but that there were many people to come to your assistance and to sort of oil the way through any institutional difficulties you might have. A tax problem, a problem with the law, there were people to take care of it. Just 2 months before the collapse of our levees in 2005, the Gallup poll is the largest testing group for polls in the United States. There was a Gallup poll conducted that asked the residents of the 22 major urban centers in the United States, all the major cities, about how happy they were. Okay? And they found the highest level of satisfaction in New Orleans. We had probably the worst school system in the United States. Public housing was utterly, utterly abysmal. We were the murder capital of the United States over a 5 or 6 year period. Despite all that, 53% of New Orleanians described themselves as extremely satisfied with their personal lives in the city. 53%. And to put that in context, only 28% of the city was white when this was taken. So it wasn't that rich white people were happy. Right? This meant that half of the African Americans who were surveyed chose the highest possible ranking of personal happiness that was available to them. 53%. Why were we so happy? Well, because the individual was stronger than the institution.
When we had a cyclone Nagis, Burmese government didn't help the victims and didn't accept the international help. If they couldn't help victims, at least they should let international communities to help them, but they didn't. And then they were trying to arrest people who are helping to Nagis victims.
There was a doctor in my neighborhood who was working at a hospital, so he didn't evacuate the city. And he was able to come home because he had a boat. He used his fishing boat. And when he got off from the hospital, he started to go around our neighborhood, finding people on rooftops and ferrying them to these outcroppings of the interstate overpasses, bridges of the interstate. On Thursday night, he told our neighbors this in a public meeting we had. He said, I found a family way back in a corner of our neighborhood. Right? And they were grandparents, children, and aunt. As I say, families lived together. They all had been in the same house, so they were all on this rooftop. And he had a little fishing boat. So he started to ferry them, the grandparents first and the babies, and then the others, two or three at a time. As he turned around, he saw a huge boat with huge motors and 5 men wearing FEMA. And he screamed at them, follow me, there's a family on a rooftop and it's getting dark, I can't carry them all. And this is what they shouted back. It's after 5 o'clock and we're not authorized for overtime. They went back to the hotel. That was the United States' response. That was Thursday. By then, probably 1,200 New Orleanians were dead. So, the whole world witnessed this in disbelief.
This is a Katrina tour. What you're looking at where all these people are walking, that is a levee. They're walking on a levee system. And if you can see this wall as we go around, this is a levee wall. The gate can be closed if we think the river is going to overflow. For Katrina, we did close the gates because we didn't know what was going to happen.
America is this kind of very strange place in the Filipino consciousness. On the one hand, we were very eager to be independent, and on the other hand, we can't seem to let go. We look to America as being the land of milk and honey. Everybody wants to move there because your life is going to get better. But to a large extent, our knowledge of America is really shaped by what we see in the mass media.
If you had seen anything from Katrina on television, this is where a lot of people waited to be rescued. They couldn't get in the building, but they were standing out here because this was naturally high ground and they had nowhere else to go. So all this area was just full of people under this overhead waiting for rescue. It's sad. Memories I don't like to look at.
To Katrina, I had watched constant news coverage of what was going on in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina passed through. The fact that it's no longer mediated, that it's no longer an image, does make a little bit of difference. But you have to remember also, we saw most of the 9th Ward through plate glass because we never got off the bus. So it kind of felt like, another television screen.
So now you're back in Orleans Parish. This is the lower 9th Ward that you're looking at here. And this is an area greatly damaged. I'm sure you've heard more about the lower 9 than many of the other parishes in the city. You do see a lot of what was the destruction, but you're going to see a lot of rebuilding and what we consider hopeful.
When we were on the bus, I think the tour guide, she was lovely, and I think she had good intentions, but it was a feeling of we on the bus and they out there, and we who live in good homes and they who do not. And maybe so much time had passed that a bus tour of the disaster area really feels like a bus tour, and you don't feel right for being on it.
But look at these homes, aren't they beautiful along here? This was a very upscale neighborhood, and it was supposed to be a bird sanctuary. So if you look at the names of the streets, they're all named after birds. So it was considered quite the place in which to live. I don't know how people feel about it since Katrina, but I would be a little worrisome for me. Take a look at this beautiful home. I just love this house. Can you imagine completely covered with water, the whole beautiful area? It's like a plantation home right in the city. All the beautiful flowers, everything was gone. But he came back, he refixed it, everything up. I mean, it's just a beautiful place. That's a lot of dedication, love of your home. Isn't it a beautiful place? Take a minute and make sure you have all your belongings, please.
I think we should have just kidnapped Biguenet.
Yeah. We should have got on the second bus. What happened?
It is being emotionally exploitative, but you know, it's money coming back to the city. They went through a disaster. Why not capitalize on it themselves?
Yeah, I get your point. There's also a level of responsibility in what you're saying about that tragedy.
But I guess I'm not looking for insightfulness from her, and I didn't even come expecting that she would say anything that would take me behind it. And actually, I'm being fascinated by all of the narratives that are behind the narrative. So for instance, clearly what happened is awful, but there's the narrative of the disaster that has happened to the landscape, all the bayous that are filled. There's the narrative of the street that was supposed to be a bird sanctuary, but the only memento of that are the street names. You know, what happened to all those fucking birds? And there are all of these narratives of disaster that are happening behind her narrative that she doesn't know that she's telling us. And I just think, that's fucking incredible. And I think I'm listening for what she doesn't know that she's telling me.
Oh, they expected too much. And I think it was just walking out of Biguenet's classroom.
Yeah, and he is amazing.
We Cajuns still refer to people from North Louisiana as Americans, as if we're not Americans ourselves, les Américains, somebody from outside of here. Just as a generalization, and there's a lot of exceptions to it, but for a standard, average American, if you're not making money, you're wasting time. For a real Cajun, it's totally different. If you're not having fun, you're wasting your life.
Like 30, 40 years ago, we'd go frogging for a living. Oh. But we'd see a big red eye, that was a bonus, because anybody could hunt them then.
It was alligators.
And we'd kill alligators, and we'd skin them, and we'd get like $15 a foot, but we'd kill some 10, 12 foot, you know. In them days, $1 was like 10 right now.
And meat would go to restaurant or?
No, they wouldn't use meat at all.
In the old days they didn't. Now that every restaurant has alligator on the menu. So there's more crawfish in Louisiana produced on crawfish farms than out here in the swamp. Way more. And a lot of crawfish that you would buy in the stores here come from China.
Yeah.
And they can sell it for less than half of what it costs us to produce it for. So it makes things difficult to make a living for people who grew up fishing and hunting. You know, when that's all you want to do. Like, you don't want to do anything else if you can make a living that way because it's fun and it's rewarding, and you can go, you and your wife, Roy and his wife fish together most of their lives. It's so different from what else you see in America, like a guy going to his job and his wife going to her job or her office, and you see the kids for a little while in the evening and watch TV or whatever. But in a Cajun family, you had a husband and wife fishing together, and on weekends the kids would fish with them, and it's a traditional way of life that's dying right now.
A small prayer for the cedars and their dead knees dotting the water like tombstones. A prayer for the cedar balls that break as you touch them and stain your fingers yellow and release from their tiny bellies the smell of old churches, of something holy. A prayer for the holy alligators. You owe them at least that. Just last night you thought of Hannah and asked them to pray with you. The prayers of alligators are potent. At night the grass is full of their red and earnest eyes. A prayer for the grass that alligators divide in the shape of a never-ending S. You lean over to pull the vegetation into the boat like a net because your friend says it can be cooked with salt and oil. Says in Burma it is called kanapa. A prayer for the languages that we know this landscape by. A prayer for the fragile French spoken by the fat fishermen who admit to the bayou, we all dying. You understand? Ça va? A prayer for the dying. May it come to us as softly as the boat drifting across the bayou. May we be unrattled. May we be as unflummoxed as the beaver.
Most people we met in that basin were fishermen, but they looked very happy and light, and they enjoyed their life and their career. The fishing looks very easy. Fishermen from my native area were very poor. They don't enjoy their life. They are not happy with their situation. There are less fish and shrimp in the country because of the weather and because of the stupid management, because of the businessman.
You see how the Atchafalaya River runs more or less north and south? Well, when oil companies came in, you can't build roads out here. The land is not solid enough, so you dig canals. And they started digging canals east to west because it was the closest way to reach a drilling location. And when they hit gas or oil, it was the closest way to get it out was to dig a canal and put a big pipe in it, the pipeline. So you have location canals and pipeline canals. Well, those activities were done with permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. And those permits required that the oil companies, the pipeline companies, everybody involved would put the place back like it was after the operation was complete. Like after the well was drilled or after they started pumping stuff out. That was not actually done one time in those 70 years. They just ignored that regulation and nobody enforced it. And the state of Louisiana is not going to challenge oil companies because they're not going to make things difficult for oil companies because we get so much money from the oil industry. In the case of BP, a lot of people who were affected in a bad way by the oil spill were working for the oil companies in the first place. So they have a kind of divided allegiance. That's where their money came from, and now that's who's ruining their ability to earn a living and the ability of their neighbors to catch fish and oysters and shrimp, and they don't know quite how to take it. We got paid by BP, we the crawfishermen, and then they came up with this thing. Did you go for that too? That where you could sign a paper saying I will never sue BP over anything involving the oil spill for the rest of the time or whatever. I got $25,000 for signing it. I said, I don't plan to sue BP for anything. Either they screwed up the environment or they didn't, but we didn't get any oil actually in the Atchafalaya Basin. So I said, if they want to give me $25,000 not to sue them, you better believe I'll take it. I had no intention of suing them anyway.
You have to ride the...
We are missing... No. He has to be so individual.
No. Oh God, everywhere he goes, I swear.
Didn't Ed just
stirring up shit.
In the last 2 weeks, I have seen a discordant country. Baltimore, New Orleans, and the crawfishermen of the Atchafalaya Basin are worlds apart, separated not just by geography, but by the nature of their particular struggles. The days of American prosperity seem just behind us, so close that they are still a part of the day-to-day, the ordinary, and yet when one is confronted by downtowns full of empty parking lots, by boarded up windows, abandoned schools, and news of a federal government that came within inches of being shut down altogether, by oil rigs anchored offshore, it is not prosperity that comes to mind, but a profound and pervasive inequality. How many people know that every hour a football field's worth of land has disappeared in southern Louisiana, lost to coastal erosion? The shape of your country is changing minute by minute. We writers had the privilege to stand on solid ground that for our children's generation will be invisible underwater. We had the privilege to think about the change that is coming, that is here, the change which our parents and our parents' parents lived through, the stories they don't tell us, the neighborhoods they have forgotten. I feel fortunate because our travels have allowed me to see an America in transition. I know that the transition here mirrors what is happening in my own country, that many of our blind spots are the same, that people of all nations and all creeds forget, and that if we may choose what to believe, we must seek wisely, counseled by knowledge and by history, and not by ignorance.